All right, so we've been in the book of 1 Peter, and we're into chapter 5. We're going to take our time in chapter 5 because there's a lot of really good material here. And so tonight we're just going to study the first 4 verses. And so how about, I'll read it here to start, and then we'll pick it apart a little bit. So here we are starting in 1 Peter 5, verse 1. He says, "Therefore I urge elders among you, as your fellow elder and a witness of the sufferings of Christ, and one who is also a fellow partaker of the glory that is to be revealed, shepherd the flock of God among you, exercising oversight, not under compulsion, but voluntarily, according to the will of God, and not with greed, but with eagerness, nor yet as domineering over those assigned to your care, but proving to be examples to the flock. And when the chief shepherd appears, you'll receive the unfading crown of glory." So that's our passage, and it's kind of an interesting one because Peter, who is our author, and he's writing to a group of Christians, and in this passage, it's sort of an aside. He sort of speaks to a subset of his audience, just the elders, just the leaders. And it's important that we kind of remember the context. I described this quite a bit last week, but the idea here, what's really carrying this book along, the purpose of it is that Peter is giving them instructions on how to endure a trial. He calls it a fiery ordeal, where these Christians are being persecuted for their faith. And so we went through last week, we sort of showed all these examples through the book where they're being slandered, they're being reviled, they're being rejected, they're being treated unjustly. And so this book is about responding in a godly way. And then specifically last week, it was about suffering, even though we're doing right. It's like even if we do all the things we're supposed to do, if we're following Christ, we still might suffer. And so what's the right attitude to have about that? He's just gotten finished describing that we really need to have a readiness to suffer. And that's the immediate context. So the last verse of that section on suffering is verse 19. We actually didn't get to it because I went too long. So here it is. It's perfect because it's really just sets this up. Remember, the verses and chapters, while sometimes they're very well placed, and I'm not saying this one is not well placed, but just remember they're not there in the original text. They're added on for organization. And so it is kind of important to read the flow of thought here. So he says in verse 19, "Those who suffer according to the will of God are to entrust their souls to a faithful Creator in doing what is right." It's really the perfect summary for what we studied last week. You guys are set out to follow Christ. You're following in His footsteps, and that may well lead you through suffering. And if that happens, if you're suffering for doing what's right, make sure that you entrust yourself to God, who is faithful, who is the Creator who made you. Entrust yourself to a faithful Creator in doing what's right. Therefore, elders. So you see, it is kind of helpful to get that flow of thought because now he's going to talk to the elders about entrusting themselves to a faithful Creator in doing what's right. The call here in this section of the book is that all of us need to keep doing what's right, even if it means suffering. And that also applies to the elders, to the leaders. What does it look like for them to entrust themselves to a faithful Creator in the midst of the fiery ordeal? And so I think what this passage is really about is it's about leading through difficult trials, which is very difficult. If you've ever led anything in any context in your life, then you know it's difficult. It's difficult even when things are going great. Because, if you're leading on planet Earth, it means that you're leading fallen, sinful people, which is a little bit of the problem. But an even bigger part of the problem is that you are a fallen and sinful person, and you're trying to do it in the fallen world. And so it's hard enough when things are going well. It's very, very hard when things are not going well. What are you like when you're in charge and it's not going well? Think about that for a minute. I think it kind of brings out the worst in people. When you're responsible and it's not going well, which I'm sure is how these leaders felt. Can you imagine what it would feel like to be a leader of this ministry, which is probably facing possibly a decline, right? It's because it's facing persecution. I'm certain that they didn't feel like it was going well. And so, what are you like when the going gets rough? I think a lot of times we go inward, what's wrong with me that this isn't going the way it's supposed to? Or we go outward, like, what's wrong with you guys that this isn't going well? Or what's wrong with you, God, because you're supposed to be in charge after all? And maybe we get paralyzed or retreat, or we get cynical, or maybe we get unrighteous and bust out the high-pressure tactics to get results. Or maybe we just try to think of a way to get out of leading the thing that isn't going well. And I kind of wonder, I don't have any evidence for this, but if for these leaders of a church that's beginning to face persecution, I'm sure it crossed their mind that they're probably going to get more than their fair share of this persecution, and they could avoid it by getting out of the position they have. And so I think Peter wants to encourage them especially, that they especially need to entrust themselves to a faithful Creator in doing what's right. And that's why he's got a word for them there, an encouragement, a call. He's like, I've got a word for you leaders specifically in the fiery ordeal. You have to shepherd the flock. That's the main point of this passage, the command. Leaders, you have to shepherd the flock. It's essential in this difficulty that you lead. Because the best thing you can have in a bad situation is a good leader, honestly. I was watching this movie this year. I don't know if any of you have seen it. It's called Greyhound. It's like a Tom Hanks World War II movie. I was kind of impacted by it, though. It's pretty new. It's about this captain of a destroyer named Ernest Krauss. It follows his story. And this is about the Atlantic crossing in World War II, where it was pretty dangerous to cross the Atlantic because of the threat of German U-boat submarines. And so what they would do is they would glob them all together in these convoys of 30 or 50 unarmed, kind of helpless personnel and material ships, and then they would take a few warships to escort them across the Atlantic. And that's his role. He's one of 4 light vessels that are basically protecting this huge blob, this vulnerable convoy. And they come under attack by what's called a wolf pack, which is a group of 5 or 6 German submarines that tail them in the day and harass them, and then at night they strike and disappear. And it's a very tense and frustrating movie to watch because there's no way they can protect all these ships. You go over here, boom, they attack over there, and you rush over there to save those people, and boom, they attack over here, and then they're gone. And they do it day in and day out. And so it follows this leader, and the kind of a theme through this is that he is constantly called away from his comforts. He's roused out of bed, and then he's interrupted in his breakfast, and so then they bring him lunch, and then he gets interrupted from that, and they bring him dinner, and then it gets knocked on the floor, and then he's been up all night, so they bring him coffee, but he never gets to drink it. And by the end of this movie, the man's been at his post for 3 days straight. And there's this scene where he asks for different shoes, and they bring him his slippers from his bedroom, and he puts them on, and you see that he's bleeding through his slippers because he's been on his feet for 3 days in this place. And it's kind of moving because you realize, at the end of this, the credits rolled, and I saw that the movie was based on a book by C.S. Forester called The Good Shepherd, which is probably what brought it into my mind. And I thought, man, that guy is a good shepherd because it's not that he's he's not super strong. It's not that he's an amazing fighter. He's not experienced. This was his first crossing ever. And yet, he saves all these lives. How? Simply by being at his post. The whole movie is him standing in the bridge giving commands. It's kind of slow in that way. But I came away with that, from that thinking, that is a great example of a good leader. Because what did he ultimately do? He was a hero basically because he was there. It was an impossible situation, and he stayed there. That's a good shepherd. And so Peter says, you guys have to be there. You have to shepherd the flock. And so what we're going to see here, we'll pick this apart. Basically, I see three kind of practical ways. How do I be a good shepherd? He tells us three things here, but he also develops a foundation. Why? Why should I shepherd the flock? And so we're going to look at that first, the why, and then the three hows that rest upon it. So that's our plan. Maybe you're sitting here, though, and you're thinking, why should I listen to a teaching about elders of some other church? How is this relevant to me? I'm not an elder of anything, let alone that church back there. Maybe the elders should be reading this passage. And, rightly they should. But I do think that this is relevant to all of us. Because after all, Peter could have written these guys privately. He didn't. He included this in the corporate letter to the whole church. He wanted the church to hear this instruction. He wants us to hear this, what it means to be a good leader and what we're to expect from leaders. And I also think it's relevant because many of you lead various ministries in this room. It's one of the great things about this church. We believe in every member ministry. And I know that a great many of you are responsible, whether it's a home church or a cell group or a junior high group or some other ministry. Maybe this passage will have an encouragement for you. But even if not, every Christian has the capability of influencing those around them. I think a lot of Christians underestimate how much influence they actually have, for good or for bad, in the people around them. So I think that this is relevant for all of us. So let's describe this foundation. Why should I shepherd the flock? What's the reason? And I'll tell you, and then I'll show you where I'm getting it. I think the answer to that is that we should shepherd the flock because you are fellow partakers in Christ's glory. That's what is actually, when you look in this passage, that's what Peter actually says about it. There's a lot of different things that might motivate you to lead, but Peter's like, here's what motivates me. I'm going to share in the glory of Jesus Christ, and that's the reason why you should. And so I see it in a couple places. First of all is in this kind of wind-up in verse 1. He says, therefore, I urge the elders among you, as your fellow elder, so that's kind of a credential. I'm a fellow practitioner. I know what it's like to lead in the fiery ordeal. And as a witness of the sufferings of Christ, Peter witnessed firsthand Jesus, the good shepherd, and the grief that he endured for the sake of doing that. He saw that firsthand. And he says, as one who is also a fellow partaker of the glory that is to be revealed, shepherd the flock. He's reminding them, he's like, I'm in this same fight as you. Peter will eventually lose his life to persecution in a gruesome fashion. He's like, I'm right in there with this as you. I share in this suffering with you, and that means that we too will be fellow partakers in future glory with Christ. For Peter, all through this book, there's this link between suffering and glory. Those two themes go together. By the way, I'm not saying that leading is pure suffering. I don't believe that. I think that it's actually a real joy to lead. But it is true that it's going to mean we could catch extra suffering for leading. And so what did he say in our last passage? It says in chapter 4, but to the degree that you share the sufferings of Christ, keep on rejoicing, so that also at the revelation of his glory you may rejoice with exultation. If you're sharing extra in the suffering of Christ, well, that's a reason to give thanks, because remember, Jesus is going to make that right. There is a future day where Jesus is going to celebrate his victory. There is going to be glory on that day. And so we should be glad to the degree that we're participating in it. You're following Jesus on a path. That path may lead you to be a partaker in suffering. But if that's true, it means you'll also be a partaker in glory. And then at the end of the passage, so that was verse 1, but notice how this whole command is bookended with this idea, because look at verse 4. When the chief shepherd appears, you will receive the unfading crown of glory. So his first and last thought is this is where Peter is looking, is the future. The chief shepherd, that's Jesus, and that he's going to return, and when that happens, he will have a crown for you. And the word there is like, in the in the athletic games. We win gold medals now in the Olympics. They won the laurel wreath. Crown says, you've been crowned. It's an awesome picture. Jesus will stand up on a podium, I'm picturing, having conquered death, and he'll say, but I want to award those who participated in this. And Peter's eyes are fixed on that. And I love that he describes it as unfading, because that's, if you read through this book, another almost constant theme is this idea of the surpassing greatness of the eternal set against the passing away of the present. The present looms so large it feels like everything, but it's nothing compared to the eternal. Because the things in the present fade away. It would be awesome to win, a laurel wreath. If I won that, I would put it on my mantle and I'd be proud of it. But it's a plant and it'll fade away. I remember when we got married, afterward we saved the wedding dress, and we also saved my wife's wedding bouquet. We actually bought a special box to store it in. These are the kind of gimmicks you fall for when you're newlyweds. And so we saved it, and we totally forgot about it until 10 years later we're cleaning out the basement, and it's like, what's in here? And I'm like, oh, and we look at it, and Sarah says, that's my bouquet. And it's, it's like brown and crumbling. And there's sort of this moment of what are we both going to say about this? And so she says, I can't believe I saved it, And I said, it's beautiful. It looks like something out of a horror movie, She's like, well, I'm really glad to see it. I'm like, yeah. Do you think it could get bugs? She looked at me and she's like, yeah. Trash. And then we moved on. It was a beautiful bouquet, but it faded away the way that all wonderful things do on planet Earth. He says, not the crown that you receive from Jesus Christ. That will be unfading. It's worth whatever it costs you in this life. I want to say something too. While we're talking about the why, I want to mention also this illustration that he uses, which is the shepherd. There's loads of shepherding imagery in the Bible. But I think it's worth pointing that out because, the main command here is in the form of an illustration. Shepherd the flock. And so what does that mean? I think it gives us a little picture of what he's actually talking about to lead. But I also think it gives us a hint about why we should care about this. So, when you're thinking about shepherding, what does a shepherd do? In the ancient world, that meant taking this flock out into the pasture or maybe the wilderness and providing for them. And it basically came down to making sure that they're fed, which you do primarily by leading them to resources, and it meant defending them and fending off threats, which is a pretty good picture of a Christian leader, right? So it describes that. But I also think that Peter's kind of tapping into this whole biblical theme. And you have to be careful here because when you're interpreting the Bible, you can't just say, it says shepherding here and it says shepherding there, so these are exactly the same. But I do think that it wouldn't be lost on his audience that he's saying something that is rich thematically in the Scriptures. So, in the Old Testament, it's God who is depicted as the shepherd of Israel. And also in the Old Testament, there's sort of this future-looking promise where he says there's going to be a shepherd. God is critical of the leaders of Israel who are like under-shepherds, and he's like, you guys are selfish and you exploit the sheep for your own good, and that makes me angry, and behold, a day is coming when I'm going to demand my flock back from you. I'll lead them myself, and I'll put my own shepherd over them. He says, a shepherd, my servant David, which is really interesting because David was long dead since then. He's saying a shepherd like David. This is messianic prophecy looking forward to a good shepherd who's going to come. And then in the New Testament, we get Jesus. And what does Jesus say? I am the good shepherd. And I think this is in Peter's mind because he's already mentioned it once in this book. In chapter 2, verse 25, he says, "For you were continually straying like sheep, but now you have returned to the shepherd and guardian of your souls." This idea of straying sheep, that's how the Bible describes human beings when they get lost and wayward from God. It's like straying sheep. Now, to our ear, we're like, well, that sounds like freedom. An animal would get away from its human master. And there are animals like that, like a deer, like they're fine out there. Like they don't need anything from us. But other animals are not like that, and sheep are not like that. Sheep depend on human beings, and the truth is a lost sheep, that's actually pretty sad because they're going to get themselves in trouble. And you can Google, compilations of videos of sheep getting ridiculously stuck, when they're lost. It's kind of funny. I'll spare you today, but just it's there if you want to reference it. But, this is the point, is that it's not a good thing. And Jesus, in Matthew 9, it says he looked out over the people and he saw that they were distressed and dispirited like sheep without a shepherd. And what does it say? It says he felt compassion for them. Jesus, it made him feel sad to see humans out from under the loving leadership of God. And so Peter says, you guys were like that, but now you've returned to the shepherd and guardian of your souls. It's like a picture of coming back under the leadership of God. He's talking about their rescue, which is possible because of what Jesus Christ come to do. It says he himself bore our sins on the cross. For by his wounds you were healed. Jesus came and gave his life to stand in our place, to clear our debt, to resolve the issues that we've placed there between us and God that alienate us, to make it possible for us to come back and be found. And that's the work of the Good Shepherd. He wants to save us lost sheep, and that's what the audience has done here. Now here's where it gets really wild, though, is that Jesus isn't like, so that's done, did the Good Shepherd thing. What does Jesus do when he leaves? He ascends to heaven and he tells Peter, all right, do you love me, Peter? And Peter says, yes, because Peter had betrayed him. And Jesus says, okay, if you love me, what you need to do is you need to shepherd my flock. Feed my sheep. Tend my lambs. Do to them like I was doing. Be a loving leader. And not just Peter. Throughout the New Testament, we see examples of the other apostles, Paul especially. Acts 20, the whole context is him saying, I'm not coming back. You guys in Ephesus have to lead without me. And the whole point of that speech is they have to shepherd the flock. In other words, when we participate in this work, we are sharing in the shepherding ministry that Jesus Christ began. We shepherd the flock. This is part of the ongoing redemptive work toward man. God shepherded Israel, Jesus shepherded the church, and will return as the ultimate shepherd. And in the meantime, when we serve as under shepherds, we join Jesus Christ in his work, which includes sharing in his present suffering and his future glory. I think that's where Peter's mind is at here. This is a big deal, what I'm calling you to do. And it should really color how we carry out our work as leaders, right? That as a leader, I should be looking back at the chief shepherd's example of sacrificial love, and I should be looking forward to sharing in his glory and recognize that I'm sharing in both. And that should really be the thing that colors what I do. So there's our foundation. So there's a big reason why we should shepherd the flock, because we're going to share with him in his work and in his glory. Let's talk about how. And my answer is very similar. I think that we should lead like those who will share in his suffering and his glory. That's a great way to think about our role and how we should carry it out. Let's read this middle section where he talks about how. We'll reread it. He says, "Shepherd the flock of God among you, exercising oversight, not under compulsion, but voluntarily, according to the will of God, and not with greed, but with eagerness. Nor yet as domineering over those who are assigned to your care, but proving to be examples to the flock. You see the rhythm here in this passage? There's 3 times he's like, not like this, but like this. Not like that, but like this. There's these 3 sort of opposing dyads. It's kind of a neat way to teach. And it makes it very easy for the teacher because I already know what my 3 points are. There's just these 3 contrasts that I think they describe the leader's attitude and motivation and also the leader's use of authority, all with a built-in antithesis provided for us by Peter. So let's look at them. I think all these are great examples of backward wisdom, by the way. It's part of what I love about this passage, is that you can go to the bookstore and find, there's a whole section on leading probably, but it's probably not going to say these things. And the reason is because as humans, we tend to factor God out when we think about things like leading. So it becomes, what's it mean for me to lead you? That's how we think of leading. But God starts from this totally different place, which is, I'm the leader, and now I'm going to give you authority to carry out in my name. It's a completely different picture. And so these are all pretty counterintuitive, I think. First one, he says, not under compulsion, but voluntarily. This is about our attitude, the way that I think and feel about my role as a leader. That it should be something I do not under compulsion. And that idea is the idea of being forced or constrained to do something. This is the idea of leading as a grind. Something that I do because of a sense of duty or because of the law, that I have to do it or else, or that I'm obligated. At my old job as a teacher, we used to call this being voluntold. You'd get an email and it's like, hey, Ben, don't forget to volunteer for which 2 weeks you want to do bus duty. It's like, well, I don't want to volunteer for any weeks of bus duty, but I'll do it because it's my duty. That's why it's called that. He says it shouldn't be that way. I actually remember when I think I have time for this story. When I first got my job as a teacher, I desperately needed it because I was engaged, okay? And so I didn't have a job, and I was going to get married in 2 weeks. I had applied at every school district in the city, and they weren't hiring. I had gotten no calls, and so not even an interview. And so my teacher, where I was a student teacher, called me up and said, Ben, I have a job for you if you want it. It's yours. And I was overjoyed. I went right down there and accepted the job. And I remember I came home that night like on top of the world because years of anxiety had just been resolved. I sat down on the porch. It was like best night ever. And my phone rang, and it was the athletic director from the school. And he was like, hey, heard the good news. Welcome aboard. Congratulations. Hey, I need a soccer coach. You ever play soccer? And I'm like, no, I mean, like 4th grade. And he's like, great, you can be the assistant soccer coach. And I was in a real dilemma because I did not want to do, look, if you guys know me at all, I did not want to do this. I cannot emphasize that point enough. And yet, what am I supposed to do? I mean, I got hired 2 hours earlier. First thing I'm going to do is say no, and I didn't even know if it was expected or not. It wasn't. He just craftily knew that I wouldn't know that, and he had already asked everyone else on the staff, so he hit up the new guy and kind of implied it was an expectation. Anyway, I'm still a little bit burned about it, but I said yes because what else are you supposed to say? And so I became the assistant soccer coach, which was a terrible outcome for all. It was terrible. And I remember the head coach figured out right away that I was useless. And so he'd be like, Coach Faust, why don't you go warm up the goalie? Which is like, you just take shots at the goal. But I was bad at that. I couldn't challenge it. I'd miss the goal. These are 8th grade kids, and this kid's like, ugh. So it was terrible, and I counted down every second until it was over. He says, not under compulsion. That is the opposite of how we should lead. Instead, he says willfully, which means genuinely, voluntarily. I'll do it. Christian leadership is a get to, not a have to. It is a great privilege that none of us come even close to deserving. Not the most righteous person in this room deserves to lead anything in the name of Jesus Christ. It is a privilege. It stems from grace, which is God's favor that we don't deserve. We're not earning God's favor by leading for Him. It's just the opposite. It's that He already approves of me and favors me. And when you realize that, and when you realize how He's loved us in the way we don't deserve, it makes you grateful. And then you realize on top of that I'm totally free to respond. I'm not really obligated. And He's given me purpose. You just take this whole picture and you're like, how could I say no to this idea? This is something that I would want to do, to serve the one who laid His life down for me and follow in His footsteps. And this is what He says is God's will. This is God's way. Unfortunately, I think we gravitate toward compulsion. I do. And I think that this is important because each one of these antitheses that are here, they're here for a reason, okay? They're here because they're things that we as human beings are kind of attracted to. And so I think that's important because this is an attitude. That's why He's reminding us. He's saying, it should be this way, not that way. And if that challenges you, let it challenge you. There have been times in my life where I've had to repent for a stinky attitude that I've developed about responsibilities that I've taken on in the name of Christ. And I need to get back to the get-to reasons under which I originally took them on. So that's a challenge. All right, number 2. Not with greed, but with eagerness. Not with greed, or maybe your Bible says sordid gain. So the last one was about our attitude. This is about our motivation. Like, why am I doing this? What am I trying to get out of this? And he right away says it shouldn't be for sordid gain. We don't lead for personal gain in this life. And that is a very necessary antithesis to call out. Because let's be honest, why do most people kind of like the idea of being called to lead something. But why? Why? Because we know we can probably gain something great. Maybe I'll get status from that. Maybe people will think I'm cool. Pride loves to be called a leader, Or maybe I'll get power and be able to influence other people to shape the world around me the way I want it to be. Or maybe I'll just get rich, because you can get rich by leading stuff in this world, which is probably what he has in mind. He's saying none of those are the reasons why we shepherd the flock. Those are terrible reasons. And unfortunately, you don't have to look that far to find examples in the Christian church of leaders who have been completely discredited for exactly this reason. It is a real temptation. And that's why he calls it out. We should never. We're just not in it for that. But here's what's confusing is he says, not with greed, but with eagerness. So I kind of wrestle with that because it's like, yeah, but I am supposed to I'm supposed to desire it, right? Is he saying that I would never get anything good out of leading? And I don't think that. I actually think that we get tremendous benefits from leading. In fact, Jesus Christ was the one who said, it's more blessed to give than to receive. If you want to be happy, lead a life of giving out. So, when I think about my own times where I've led something, yes, there were examples where that cost me something and I suffered. I can count a few scars, I guess. But I can also just as easily count tremendous blessings that I've received from doing that. Because for one thing, it really forces you to draw near to God, which is a blessing in and of itself. It's hard. So it puts you on your knees in prayer. That's a good thing. Things in my character that I'm certain I never would have gotten around to working on, where that issue was forced because of the leadership position that I was in. Or I just think about, ways that I think that it's made me a better husband or a better father, because a lot of those leadership skills are transferable to other areas of life. It's definitely made me a better friend. And some of my closest friends come from leading alongside others in the yoke. And there's also benefits like being able to see God's purpose advance. So what I'm saying here is I'm saying, listen, it's righteous to desire to lead. That's a good thing. But it is a very importantly different thing than selfish greed. Do you see the point I'm trying to make there? Not with greed, yet with eagerness. Number 3, last one, he says, nor yet as domineering over those assigned to your care, but proving to be examples to the flock. Not domineering. This is about your authority. God delegates authority. It's part of his created order, that some things should be in charge of other things, and that sometimes we play the role of submitting to authority, and sometimes we play the role of using authority. But he says you're not to domineer. And I think that's a really important antithesis because, listen, what do we do with authority? What do we do with leadership when we get it? Well, we usually use it for greed, and then we get a stinky attitude about it, and then we use it to domineer over other people. That's like a pretty decent description of what humans do with power. All right? When my kids were real little, like Addie was 4 and Tommy was like just walking, like 1, maybe just turned 1. Those are the hard years because you have to stay right on top of them, because they're mobile, but they don't listen. And so, you're literally saving their life all the time because they're trying to fall down the steps, they're trying to put something in an outlet. And so I remember one day I was watching both my kids at home, and I had to go to the bathroom, which is actually kind of a dilemma, We used to have this little trampoline that we would zip Tommy in so you could go to the bathroom. But anyway, I remember I turned to my 4-year-old, and I said, hey, you know what? I'm going to go to the bathroom. Will you watch your brother? And I'll never forget her eyes. I think this was a formative moment because she still loves babysitting and stuff. Her eyes got huge, and she said, me? And I was like, yeah, just like 2 minutes. Just keep him safe for 2 minutes. I can do it. And I'm like, well, she's taking that really seriously. Fastest trip ever to the bathroom. I come out, she's sitting there beaming, and he's nowhere to be seen. Okay? And I'm like, where's Tommy? And she says, don't worry. And I'm like, I'm worried. Where is he? I put him in timeout. I'm like, timeout? He's never received a timeout in his life. I'm like, why did you put him in timeout? He was bad. And you could just see this crazed look in her eye. It gave me chills, like, who are you? And I go and find him, and he's sitting there, sad. First ever time out of his life given to him by his sister. She's drunk with power. That is our instinct. When you give us power over others, aha, my dominion. He says, not that. Don't exercise dominion. Again, I just want to point out how backwards this would have been to the audience. To us as like Americans, we're like, yeah, no one will tell me what to do. This is ancient Rome. They had Caesar was their example. The whole point was to get dominion over everyone else. And if you didn't have dominion over anyone, it's because God had cursed you. So this is so backwards for Peter to say, if you have authority, do not rule over others. How radical. But it would not fit our foundation to domineer over people. How could I do that? I'm a sheep, right? I'm a wayward sheep that was found. I'm a sinner for whom Jesus Christ died. And look at the shepherd that I'm following. He's a foot washer. He set aside his godly attributes so that he could come and serve us and be humiliated and be rejected himself and die in our place. So where in that equation do I get to be king of the castle? No, he says not domineering. What did Jesus say? 10:45. For even the Son of Man, for even God, did not come to be served, but to serve and give his life as a ransom for many. That's our example. Later on, he says, those who are recognized as rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their great men exercise authority over them. But it's not this way among you. Whoever wishes to become great among you shall be your servant. A classic backward wisdom statement, and I'm sure everyone sat up and was like, did he say that right? Everyone who wants to become great must be your servant. And then he doubles down because he's Jesus. Whoever wishes to be first among you shall be slave of all. This is what it means to be great in the kingdom of God, is to be the one who serves. This is the concept of servant leadership. It's not about my dominion. It's not about trying to get over as many people as possible to serve myself. That's how the world does leadership. This is about getting under as many people as possible to serve them and push them up toward Christ, because that's exactly what he has done for me. And so this is a complete reversal of how we think of leadership. What's the opposite of domineering over? It doesn't say, though, that we don't lead them, right? He says that you don't domineer, but rather you should be an example. Set the example of servanthood if you want to be great in the kingdom of God. A spiritual leader looks like someone who says, where is Jesus Christ going? I'm going to try to go there, and you guys should come with me because he's right. It's someone who's pointing to Christ, not to themselves. I like this quote from Oswald Sanders. He says, we normally think our main job as leaders is to make sure we want to see them growing. In reality, our main job is to make sure that they see us growing. Great point. You don't have to be some sort of superstar, teacher, spiritual guru, amazing person to be a leader. You just have to be an ordinary person who's determined to follow Christ and who's willing to do that in a way that other people can see. That's what it means to be a leader. All right, well, let's conclude it. I think it's kind of hard to apply a passage like this because it's written to such a specific group in such a specific situation. So here's kind of my go-to question that I ask in that situation is, what does the Holy Spirit want us to do with this passage? And I think that probably depends a lot on where you're at with the Lord. If you're sitting here tonight as a Christian leader, then I think that what you should get from this passage is the encouragement that Peter has. Take this encouragement from Peter, that if you're suffering because you've led, then mark this, Jesus is going to make that right. You'll be sharing in his glory. And it'll come up when he places that crown on your head that'll never fade away. And the work that you do, in whatever capacity you're leading, is critically important. And even more important, the harder it's going. So I think it's an encouragement. If you're here and you're aspiring to Christian leadership, I'd love to lead something someday. Well, that's great. What I would point you to in this passage is the description that he gives of what really makes someone a leader. It's not about your rank or your role or your title. It's not even about how well respected you are necessarily. It's really about being a servant. My advice to you would be to focus on the cross and serve as many people as you can in the best ways that you can to advance them toward God, and let God be your PR manager and worry about when it's time to call you into a position of leadership. If you're thinking the opposite, Christian leadership's not for me, I don't aspire to Christian leadership, well, that's okay too, because not everyone's called to Christian leadership. But what everyone is called to is servant love. We are all called to that. And so actually, I'm going to give the exact same advice to the person who doesn't aspire as I just gave to the person who does aspire to be a leader, which is that you should focus on the cross and you should put all your energy into sacrificially loving others as a servant in servant love, and let God worry about whether or not to call you into a position of leadership. Because some of the best leaders I know in this fellowship are people who never really aspired. And finally, if you're here because you're investigating the God of the Bible, you want to find out what this God is about, you're trying to understand Christianity, then the thing in this passage I would point you to is the invitation of the Good Shepherd. That the whole point of all of this is that Jesus Christ came to call you back, to rescue us back into his family, and that he's paid the price so that we can do that, and that you're invited to receive that for yourself. That's really the only thing here that matters for you. So, quite a bit there in 4 little verses. And next week we'll keep going and read a few more verses out of chapter 5.